Good afternoon. Replacing Scott Lingenfelter, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. John A. Bernbaum, a teacher and educational leader for more than 45 years. This quote from his bio seems very descriptive of his life and personality. Imagine how I felt standing in Red Square for the first time in 1990 and thinking to myself, what is this kid from the west side of Chicago doing in the capital city of America's Cold War rival?
Perfect.
So how did he get there? Here's a brief history from his website. Ever since he was in junior high school, he wanted to be a teacher. After he completed his doctorate in European and Russian history, he worked at the U.S. Department of State for 4 years, but knew after a few years that he really wanted to work with young people. His professional life, though, has gone beyond teaching and involves some exciting jobs. For example, after 20 years with the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which involved working with international student programs, he was asked to give leadership to the Russia Initiative, which eventually resulted in 15 years serving as president of the Russian-American Christian University in Moscow. When the Kremlin closed down the university in 2012, the Board of Trustees sold the campus, but decided to continue its support for Christian higher ed in Russia and Ukraine. They established a program called BEAM, which stands for Business and Education as Mission, as a private foundation dedicated to develop and support educational programs that equip Christians in Russia and Ukraine and other former republics of the USSR for leadership. He was asked to serve as BEAM's president and CEO and has continued in this role since 2014, especially in Ukraine. Beginning in August of 2022, he accepted an invitation to be a senior fellow at the Paul Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, while remaining involved in BEAM's work. So what else does Dr. Bernbaum do now? To share what he learned during his 25 years visiting in the Soviet Union and now Russia, he wrote a book. It's called Opening the Red Door, and he's currently working on several others. He also has a website, teaches for Calvin's Call program, and gives frequent lectures. Whew. Let's give this exceptional man a warm welcome to HASC.
Well, it's a joy to be here. This is my first opportunity to teach in this program. I've heard about it for a period of time, but it's really a great privilege to be a part of it. It does remind me a little bit of a Baptist church because there's nobody in the front row. And so I'm thinking, are these all Baptists? Or aren't there any Baptists in Holland? I mean, there's got to be a couple couple Pentecostals, couple Baptists. No, there are a couple. Okay. Anyway, I just want to mention briefly, she gave you more detail than you needed about my background, but I did want to emphasize the point that I had no intention to be working in Russia and Ukraine for the majority of my life. I was going to be a high school teacher and a basketball coach. That was my ambition. And the heroes of my Christian school in Cicero, Illinois, Timothy Christian School, were the heroes of my life. They weren't the Chicago Cubs or White Sox or Bulls or any of the sports fields. My heroes were the school teachers that I had. So I decided to put my whole life into education. Pardon? It's moved in Elmhurst. When I was there, it was in Cicero. Any of you from Cicero?
Oh, but I worked at Hawthorne.
You worked in Hawthorne. Okay, you're close. Yeah, good. Well, I still consider myself a Chicago boy, although I've been here on the eastern part of the country for the majority of my life. Well, we're taking on a very complex topic, and I've been asked to do this in 2 sessions. And I'm going, how can I do this in 2 sessions? This war is extraordinarily complex. So my first warning to you is, if you are engaged in conversation with friends and they have quick and simple answers to what's going on in this war, they have no idea what they're talking about. This is extraordinarily complex war. Not only because there are so many countries involved, but the massive flow of weapons and weapon systems, missile systems, even adds more complexity to it. So what do you do in 2 sessions? We're going to have to make some summary highlights and point out some mountain peaks for you. I will leave plenty of time for Q&A, but I want to tell you right now that a lot of the questions you're going to ask me, I'm going to say, I don't know. Or it's complicated. And I hope you're going to appreciate that. I've already been asked several times when the war is going to end. Now, how am I supposed to know that? But let me tell you a little bit about my own particular involvement in Ukraine. She's already talked to you about the fact that I was involved in Russia for 25 years, starting as Christian college. I mean, it was like a Hope College or a Calvin College in Moscow. And Yeltsin welcomed us in. We had an extraordinary positive experience with Russians for 10 years, and then Putin came along. I thought, Putin was going to become a good friend of President Bush. So it looked like for a while we're going to have a partnership between our 2 countries, but it quickly deteriorated to the point where in 2012, 5 months after we moved into our new campus facility, which took us 10 years to build, we were kicked out of the country. Now, I don't have any regrets about that. People have oftentimes asked me, you must feel real sad about leaving this beautiful facility behind, but I knew from the beginning that our involvement in Russia was going to be a seed planting operation. I studied the history of Russia, Soviet Union for years in graduate school, and I know their history. It's a painful history. And so I thought if we can get anything done, like planting seeds, that would be probably the most important thing that we can do. Putin will not live forever. I better leave it to go with that. He won't live forever, but my thought is that at some point, he's going to be removed, and there's some possibilities there. But when Putin kicked us out, the Russians kicked us out, we focused our attention on Ukraine. And we've been working with a network of about 10 seminary and Christian colleges in Ukraine. And our function was to help train Christian leaders for the future of Ukraine. So that's how I got involved. I visited there a number of times. I visited on the campuses of these schools. I fell in love with Ukraine. First time I came there after the collapse of communism, I saw these young people on the streets of Ukraine, and I said, I love these kids. They had so much energy. They wanted to make their country into democracy. They wanted to clean up the corruption. They really wanted to do great stuff. So it was a very exciting place to work. And some of the young university presidents that I got to know are people with a real vision for the future of that country. And then February 2022, the war started. So I'm telling you that to say, this is not just an academic interest for me. These are my friends who are getting bombed. These are schools that I know that we helped fund that have been destroyed by the Russian forces. So it's a very painful process for me when I got involved in this. And I decided immediately to begin to write a weekly newsletter. First of all, for my own kids, my own children. I have a large family. And then for other members of our church, just to help them understand what's going on in this war. And I've been doing that for the last year. And you'll see a reference to it if you're interested in getting that survey, that two-page essay every week or so. But that's a little bit of the nature of my involvement. So when I talk about this stuff, you're going to see some emotions come out because it's tough handling some of the information I get. Now, just a little bit more of background, then we'll start. I get somewhere between, it changes now, but right now it's about 6 to 15 messages a day from Ukraine. They're from Christian ministries, they're from intelligence and defense agencies, they're from Christian think tanks, they're from news sources. So I'm getting a constant flow of information every day. And I want you to know that that can be a very painful experience. When I get news reports every day of missiles that hit in this town, hit in this town, hit in this town, 5 people killed, 2 people killed, a maternity ward gets hit, 5 women delivering kids are killed. It gets to be a terribly painful process for me. But then I read stories of heroes, people who step up and do some remarkable things. So it's an emotional roller coaster, I want you to know. Okay. Let's see if we can get started. So all I got to do is know how to flick the foot. Can you help me make a move here? Now it's a go. Ian's remarkable. So he figures all this stuff out. That's great. All right. This is the world that most of us have lived in. A lot of you are about my age, and this is the world we lived in. A world of communism versus democracy. America and NATO versus the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. And so the red countries are the ones that were communist related, and the blue countries are a part of the NATO system. Some of you, probably when you were in elementary school or junior high school, when the alarms went off in 1961 over the Cuban Missile Crisis, you climbed under your desk. You remember that, some of you? Those were scary days. I'm going to tell you now, those days are over. It's a different world right now. Before I get to that, let me tell you a little bit about Ukraine. I assume that when this war broke out in Ukraine, very few of you could find it on a map. So since then, if you've been reading newspapers, you got a rough idea about Ukraine. Let me just point out a couple things to you real quickly. It's important when you study international relations like this that you understand location. Location, location, location. It explains a lot. We're not going to have the time to go into all the warfare issues and the political issues that are going on here, but you'll notice that on the western boundary of Ukraine are a series of NATO countries that border right on Ukraine. Putin made a very serious miscalculation when he decided to attack Ukraine for many reasons, but one of the most serious miscalculations was not giving proper attention to the western border of the country. Because these NATO countries immediately stepped in to help the Ukraine. Food, medicine, sleeping facilities, places for refugees to go. So that's a very significant factor. You'll notice the location of Crimea, that particular island that dangles off the end of the country. That's a very important part of the war. We're going to talk about that both today and a little bit later next week when I'm with you for the second session. That's one of the key matches, key indicators in this country, this context. Now, to give you a little bit of context, Ukraine is about the size of Texas. To be precise, it's 87% of the size of Texas. It's the largest country in Europe. When the war started, 43 million people. Putin made many miscalculations, but one of his most significant miscalculations was not to think about the fact that if I attack this country, how am I going to control it or occupy it when there are 43 million people who live in the country? So that's a little example of the reality of what's going on in this part of the world. You may know that a couple of days ago, Putin visited a town right on the Sea of Azov. We'll talk about that a little bit later and probably next week. I'm going to talk to you about autocracy or the autocrats. You recognize some of these faces? The war that's going on in Europe is not about saving Ukraine. This is the most important idea I want to communicate to you this afternoon. This is not a war over the saving of Ukraine. This is a war between democracy and autocracy. And I'm going to explain that in some detail in a few moments. But that's the big picture. There are some people in this country who are walking around and saying, let's not get involved. Who cares about Ukraine? That's a very foolish understanding. Because what's at stake here are a bunch of autocrats who are trying to totally disrupt the world political system. And China and Russia in particular are trying to take control of the international community, take power away from NATO, and become the ones who are now ordering the world system. They're out to subvert the current security system in Europe and in the Middle East. So it's that kind of a battle. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. So let's talk about a couple things. As I already said, the Cold War is over. It's no longer communism versus democracy. It's no longer the free market versus centralized economics. Forget that stuff. Those days are over. This is now a conflict between democracies and autocracies. And autocracies, many of them started off with what we call imitation democracies. When communism collapsed, many of the former countries that were a part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics began to look like democracies, and their leaders began to create votes and have a Congress and pass some laws. But analysts look back on that now and say that was, quote, just imitation democracy. They weren't serious about creating democratic countries. They had no interest in that. And many of those countries have become very authoritarian since then. So it's a big battle that's going on here. And again, Western security is a threat here. So let's talk about autocracies. You can read that yourself, but I'll read it to you real quickly. Autocracies are not run by one bad guy, but by sophisticated networks composed of kleptocratic structures, security services, and professional propagandists. Now, you know what the word kleptocracy means? Kleptocracy is a system of rule by a few who steal the resources from their people. That's a kleptocracy. A few people take control and seize the resources of their people. So it's about power and it's about greed. There's a network of these. These autocrats have no ideology except greed and power. They don't care what your ideology is. They don't care if you're running a capitalist system or a socialist system or what you're doing in terms internally. So all they care about is protecting the assets they have, and they're going to help each other if they got involved in conflict. So it's a very serious situation. The security services in Russia work together with the security sources in China, work together with the security sources in Iran, in North Korea. All of these autocracies are connected together to preserve each other. The president of China recently visited Moscow. Do you think Putin and the president of China are friends? Do you think they'd go golfing together? They don't trust each other. They're using each other. And of course, Russia has now become a pawn of China. Russia is a servant to China right now. They go through this business of standing in front of television screens and talking about how united they are in reality. But when you read the publications of what they produce at the end of their press conferences, China's saying one thing, Russia's saying something else. China has no interest at this point in having a confrontation with the United States and NATO. But China is trying to posture like they're a peacemaker. They can bring countries together like they've done recently in the Middle East. But that's an example. I want to say a couple other things about this real quickly. These kleptocracies steal money from their people and then ship that money to banks in England, France, the Caribbean, and the United States. So their assets, their stolen assets, are sitting in banks in the West, which guarantee protection by the rule of law. So here are these crooks, these thieves, who've stolen the money from the people, but they're smart enough to put them in the West where they get a rule of law to take care of them. And we're talking about billions of dollars. And the reality, according to Ann Applebaum, and I think she's right now, the autocrats are winning this war, this conflict. And I think, as a political scientist, as a historian who studies this stuff, this period of time is more dangerous right now than it was in the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is a much more dangerous period. Primarily because people like Putin have no accountability anymore. Putin is incredibly isolated. He talks to about 4 or 5 people, and that's it. In the old days in the Soviet Union, there was a Politburo made up of 15, 20, 25 different people. And they would set the policy for the person who was the general secretary of the Communist Party. So when Khrushchev got out of hand, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Politburo said, time for you to go. There was a coup. They didn't kill him. They got him a nice little bungalow outside of Moscow and said, stay here and shut up, and you'll be okay. Those days are gone. Putin right now is running the country with almost no accountability. It's a frightening reality. And kleptocrats, of course, have learned to use American banks, French, British, and American financial counselors to handle their money. These people have figured out the weaknesses in American political systems. And so what they're doing is that they're finding these financial people to handle their assets, to hide their assets, protect them. And the West is complicit. The state of Delaware has hundreds of corporations that are anonymously owned. There are other states in the United States also that have done the same thing. Now, I'm telling you that to say that's a whole nother subject. We could do a whole course on this, but we're not going to go into it right now. But what I'm trying to say is we've got some responsibility in this country because we're helping these autocrats. There was a member of Congress a couple of weeks ago who submitted a proposal. It was called the Shame Act. Shame Act. It was an act designed to stop Americans from helping the governments of our enemies. Because many congressmen, when they retire, they go to work for China, or they go to work for Russia. How are we going to be involved in a conflict like this when some of our own congressional people are working for these governments? If you work for the Russian government, I have a member of my former church who was a former congressman. When he retired, when he lost an election, he went to work for the Russians. Not bad. $200,000 a year. Not a bad salary. When this resolution was offered in the Congress, many congressmen got angry and refused to even talk about it because they see some job opportunities for themselves. So until we clean this up, we've got some serious problems. I got to get off this and move on with life. But that's important that you begin to understand. Now, let me tell you a little bit about autocracy. These autocrats learn from each other. And fundamentally, as I've mentioned several times, and I'm going to say it again, they have two goals in life: maintain power, maintain greed. That's part of their goal. Putin knows that as an autocrat, there's no safe place a retired autocrat can retire. If you're an autocrat and you want to get out of the business, you can't. You got three options. You get exiled, you go to prison, or they kill you. That's not a very good retirement program if you're an autocrat. So they're desperate to hold on to political power. If they lose power, they lose everything. So the primary drive, and I need you to hear this clearly, the primary drive behind Putin is to engage in war because his economy is in serious condition. His country is really struggling. His population is on a decline. He used to be a popular man. He is no longer popular. When he was re-elected president in 2012, 1 million people gathered on the streets of Moscow opposed to his re-election. He was so angry at them because he said, I made all you people rich and now you're turning against me. And so the repression began in Russia. And now the political repression in Russia is unbelievable. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But also in terms of what he has stolen, he and his buddies. The estimates are now that Putin and his cronies have stolen $1 trillion from Russians. Friends, that's never happened in history. That someone came along and stole $1 trillion from their own government and put it in offshore banks. Estimates are now, and these are low estimates, that Putin is probably worth $200 billion. He's probably the richest man in the world. $200 billion. If you have that kind of wealth and you need that kind of power, you'll do anything to sustain it. And the people who gathered around him on his National Security Council, most of them are friends of his from Petersburg. He's made them into billionaires. And they know if he goes, they go. So there's a tremendous pressure on these folks to maintain their political power. Now, how did they get there? I'm going to do this real quick. By the way, you can get an hour of political science credit from Hope College for this course if you wanted to. I can talk to Ian about that. We'll get you a little transcript. I'm just kidding, of course. But let's talk a little bit about the playbook. This is the way it works. Populists emerge and come to their people and they say, our country is being ripped off by all of these elites. They're stealing money from our country. You need to elect me to be the president and I'll clean the place up. We'll get rid of all this corruption and I'll protect your interests. So they come up with this populist agenda. They found weaknesses in democracies. So they know how they can penetrate these democratic systems. They know how they can manipulate election laws and so forth. So they get themselves elected using a very popular kind of agenda. I'm out to help you. Once they get in power, they begin to polarize the society. You are either friends of mine or you're enemies. No middle ground. You either support what I do or you're going to pay a price. So polarization is the second step. And you can see this happening in autocracies all over the world. They're doing the same thing. And then the third is what we call post-truth. It's a post-truth politics, which means these autocrats operate in a context where there is no such thing as truth. It's whatever you want to make it to be. Putin, for example, and I'm going to keep working on Putin because he's the principal focus here. Vladimir Putin is a pathological liar. I can say it again. The guy's a pathological liar. He just makes stuff up. Political scientists call this meta-narrative. Meta-narrative. He just creates a story to justify what he's doing. So when he gets involved in certain kinds of things, he says, I'm here to defend traditional Christianity. The West has gone off the deep end, but Russia is a traditional Orthodox Christian community, and I'm here to defend traditional Christianity. I mean, what a joke. On Easter Sunday in Russia, the most sacred of any church celebration in the Orthodox Church, 2% of the population are in church. Putin is divorced, has a couple mistresses, has at least 2 children of his own, and at least 2, if not 4, other children by various mistresses. But it's all kept secretly. We know more about this in the West than they know about it in Russia. He protects himself and uses this guise about I'm a Christian leader and so forth and so on. But that's just one example. Here's another example that happened a couple years ago. I want to restore the Russian Empire. I want to rebuild the Soviet Union to what it was like before it collapsed. I'm Peter the Great. I'm like Catherine the Great. I want to achieve what they achieved. And so he would go around using this language. It's a meta-narrative. It has no relationship to truth. I mean, if you're going to try and rebuild the Russian Empire and recreate the Soviet Union, you wouldn't steal $1 trillion from your own people. You wouldn't pass mobilization laws to recruit all these young people to fight in a war they don't want to fight in and have 100,000 young people in their 20s and 30s flee the country. 100,000 of the best and brightest people in Russia left when he announced mobilization for the war. You wouldn't do this if you were trying to build Russia into a Russian empire. It just makes a mockery of what the guy is saying. So the point is, you can make up any story you want. When you completely control the media like he does, you can say whatever you want. That's the reality of this post-truth world. Here's a battlefield map, and I'm not going to go into this right now. I mean, there's so much to talk about, friends, in a limited period of time. So I just wanted to give you a little feel for the reality here. Basically, the area you see in the reddish or pinkish color is the area currently occupied by the Russians. And the yellow space is the area largely controlled by the Ukrainian government. And I want to say quickly, and there's a lot of detail to talk about here, but life for the most part in the Ukrainian controlled area is coming back to neutral, to normal. They get missiles periodically, but now about 75% of every missile shot at them is knocked down. So the Russians no longer have the effectiveness to target the country. They were going to go in and destroy the entire infrastructure of the electrical system, knock out all of the electrical plants in the country. They failed. The Economist reported a couple of days ago, and Wall Street Journal reported a couple of days ago also, this amazing story about these electrical workers in in Ukraine, that have learned to repair those systems almost as quickly as they're destroyed. The Russians hit them with a missile. Those engineers get in there and repair the thing, and it's up and running the next day. In Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, they've had unlimited power for 4 weeks straight. They're no longer losing their power. So all of these threats that we're going to freeze the Russians, we're going to freeze the Ukrainians by knocking out their infrastructure, have failed. But what's going on in the area controlled by the Russians is a very dismal story, but I'm going to keep moving on. Let's come back. So I'm going to give you some suggested outcomes for both Ukraine and for Russia. And I want to say that I'm not a prophet. I'm just going to give you some suggestions. Because we only have 2 weeks to be together, I thought I would at least share with you some of the possibilities here, and we can talk about this in more detail next week. But I wanted you to give you a little sense of the reality that we're talking about right now in these two parts of the world. The first possibility, the first option for Ukraine, is that they'll push the Russians out of the country even at the end of this year. NATO is pouring so many weapons. Some of the best weapon systems in the world are now going into Ukraine. Unfortunately, there was a long drag time. A lot of this stuff should have gotten there quicker, but the stuff that's there right now is really remarkable. At the current time, estimates are that about 1/3 of the Ukrainian army has NATO standard weapon systems. That's remarkable. They could far outmatch the Russians in any battlefield contact. And the weapons are pouring in. So that's part of the reality, I think. So some people think that the Russians could be out of that country, could be pushed out some people are even saying by the end of the summer or the end of the year. That's option number one. Another option that Ukraine is looking for is to try and join the European Union and NATO. They want that very, very badly. There are complexities in both of those situations for Ukraine because of their past history. So there's not a quick answer to that question. Can they join NATO? Can they join the European Union? We'll see. We'll see. Some people talk about Ukraine becoming the Europe's porcupine. What they're talking about is, if Ukraine can't join NATO, how will it defend itself? And so the allies are basically saying, let's make Ukraine so powerful that no one will dare attack that country, like Israel is. The most advanced air defense system in the world, missile systems, defensive systems. Some people are even talking about building a 100-kilometer border around Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. Not only push the Russians out, but create this demilitarized zone along the border to give them additional protection. That's a third possibility. Ukraine will probably have the most powerful army in Europe by the time the war is over. Poland, by the way, is working hard to build its army, and it may have the second most powerful army in Europe. I mean, the reality of what's happening in Europe is dramatically changing. Are you still with me, folks? Okay, let's go a little go. The last comment is about this continuing war of attrition. And this is what I would, among journalists, this is what I call the herd mentality. You know, these journalists get an idea, and then every magazine, every newspaper in the country picks this idea up. It's a stalemate. It's a war of attrition. The war is going to go on for years. It's never going to end. And Putin, it's possible, but not likely. But it's an option. So if you want to understand some options here, there they are. How about Russia? What are the options for Russia? One of the goals that Putin likes to achieve is to create what he calls a frozen conflict, where he creates a crisis in an area. He sends in his troops, his intelligence officers. He's done this in Georgia. He's done this in Armenia. He's done this in Moldova. He goes in there and he starts a crisis, and they have a civil war begins to take place. And then he puts in some Russian soldiers to be mediators in the middle of that, and that disqualifies all of those countries from NATO membership, because you can't join NATO if you have a frozen conflict. So Putin is creating these things to keep some of these people out of NATO altogether. He would like to do this with Ukraine. And some people were worried when the Chinese leader came here that he would talk about coming to the peace table and he would negotiate a peace between Russia and Ukraine. That would be a frozen conflict. And then, of course, those of us who know Putin and know Russia said, what is Putin going to do? He's going to rearm his troops. He's going to start up his defense industry and start making munitions at an incredible rate. He'll develop the new missile systems. He'll wait 2 or 3 years till the United States gets tied up in the conflict between Taiwan and China or some other crisis. The United States gets distracted, and he'll hit Ukraine again. That's the way he operates. That's the way the guy thinks. He's already told us the countries he intends to go after. He's identified the 3 Baltic states by name. He's identified Poland. He's warned them. I'm coming. Moldova. It's a lot like Adolf Hitler did in Mein Kampf. He told us what his agenda was. We didn't pay very careful attention. This time, we know what his agenda is. The second possibility is the collapse of the Putin regime. That is very unlikely, but we don't know. One thing we've learned about autocracies, autocrats, is they look very formidable on the outside, but they're fragile and they can collapse very, very quickly. So you have to be very careful about some predictions that you make. Now, mass protests in Russia right now, probably not likely. Most of the people who are angry with Putin have left, have flown the country. Otherwise, they're in jail. They open their mouth. If they even use the word war, it costs them 15 years in jail. So dissidents have fled. Young people have fled. Some of these emergent democratic leaders that were a part of civic action groups, civic organizations, they've fled. So it's not likely that a mass protest would begin. But in addition to all of what I just told you, Putin has 5 different security services protecting him and his buddies in the Kremlin. 5 different ones, including one personal armed force that is accountable only to him. And the estimates are that force is somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people who work directly for Putin. They don't go report to the Ministry of Education. See, I'm an educator. To the Ministry of Defense. They don't report through some security agency. They report directly to the president. So the likelihood of a mass protest or of a coup by the elites, the oligarchs, not probable. Not probable. But again, I want to say, you never know. You know, when I think about this, I think about the collapse of communism. December 1991, when they pulled down the flag and they put up the tricolor in Moscow. I was there during that period of time. Here's communism, 70 years of communism, and the country implodes. Communism is done. Was there anybody who rose up to defend communism? Zero. There was no popular revolt saying, wait a minute, you can't take apart my political. Same thing happened in 1917 when the Romanov dynasty collapsed after World War I. Was there a public protest by people who liked the czars? Not one. So here are 2 examples of autocracies, rules from the top, that collapsed in Russia and nobody cared. Nobody defended it. So I wonder what happens. What would happen in Russia right now if there was a sudden dramatic change in leadership? Oh boy, we got to stop that clock. Will you slow that clock down for me, please? I got to tell you real quickly, the mass arrest that's been issued for Putin because of the kidnapping of children from Ukraine is a very serious issue. And the consequences of that mass arrest, we're not sure of all the implications, but that's the first time the leader of a major state was declared a war criminal. It's never happened before. There have been a couple small level dictators who have been accused of war crimes, but never a president of a leading state. So now the world knows the president of Russia is a war criminal. He can't step into any country in the world except those of close allies, and he doesn't have very many of those. So the man who's the Minister of Justice in Germany says, if Mr. Putin puts his foot on the ground in Germany, we'll put him in jail. That's the reality Putin has to face. The woman who's working with him on this kidnapping of children, you've read about her, I think, Maria, beautiful Maria, 38 years old. She will never be able to go to another country the rest of her life because she's a war criminal. Unless she goes to countries like North Korea or Iran that aren't friends of anybody else, but she lands any other place, she's in jail. And of course, the other thing is that Russia, even if Putin stays, but certainly if he doesn't stay and many of his colleagues emerge, the status of Russia as a major power will be significantly reduced, and it will become what we call a regional power. In a certain sense, it's a regional power already. They're subservient to China right now. But that's the reality we're looking at here. Okay. I'm ready for your questions. You have one. Whoop, we're going to get you on the microphone, man.
It is complicated. I have a friend who was in the Russian army, who is Ukrainian from the eastern part of Ukraine. And he was very upset. Now he's our older guy, more my age. And so he was in the Russian army back when Ukraine was a part of Russia. And he was raised speaking Russian. And when Ukraine took over, it really bothered him that he had to learn Ukrainian. And he is also of the belief that there are the SS troops in the eastern or the western section of Ukraine, which would want to take over. Now, so I guess the point I'm getting at is that it would appear as though there are, maybe not a majority, but there are a group of people in the eastern section of Ukraine that are still loyal to Russia.
That are still what?
Loyal to Russia.
Yeah, yeah. You remember that map of Ukraine? That area, of course, was a very popular area for Soviets to bring in engineers because there's mining industries, coal, steel. It was kind of a very popular mineral-based part of the country. And so it played a very significant role in the Soviet Union. And the Russians sent in a lot of their people to live in those areas. And so they are more inclined to be partners with Russia. But what is very interesting is that in 1991, when the Soviet Union came to an end, they had a vote among the people. Everybody uses plebiscites. So they asked the population of Ukraine, what do you think about the idea of becoming independent? Huge percentage, particularly in the West, wanted to join, make Ukraine an independent country. But even in the eastern zones of the country, where there were these pro-Russian communities, 68 to 72% of those people also said they would rather be independent. So there's that kind of mixture. You got to be very careful when you make generalizations about Ukraine, because the different parts of the country are very different parts. So if you think of, let me go back to that map. How can I find it? Can I do that quickly? The western part of the country, the area called around Lviv, close to Poland, that's the center of democracy in Ukraine. I mean, they've been under the influence of the Polish people. They've been under the influence of Lithuania. They've been through the Reformation and the Renaissance. They've had all the experiences that many of the European countries have, whereas many of those in the eastern part of the country never had that experience of democracy. They've never had any direct exposure to democracy, and they never had any impact by the Reformation or the Renaissance. So the whole concept of human rights and human dignity were never part of their culture. So you have those kinds of divisions in Ukraine. So long answer to your question. But what's beginning to happen now, particularly since 2004, when they had the Orange Revolution, and 2013 and 14, when they had another revolution called the Revolution of Dignity, the Ukrainian people have risen up and said, we want independence. We want democracy. We want to get rid of corruption. We want to rebuild our country. So there's been a tremendous unification taking place on the part of these people. And so some of the things that you see going on in Ukraine right now are extraordinarily exciting because this sense of unity and distinctiveness is going on. That's a big question. I could talk much longer, but let's just leave it there. Go ahead, sir.
I have first a comment. My wife's cousin was very high-ranking vice president.
Was what?
A very high-ranking vice president of John Deere Corporation.
Uh-huh.
And they built a plant in Russia. He had to live in Moscow for a couple of years. He met Putin several times. And he knew his apartment was bugged, his car was bugged, his office was bugged. But he would communicate with family and friends. He'd always describe Putin as interesting. That's code for evil, by the way.
That word.
We all knew what it meant. Just a sidelight. And your outcomes for Russia, I wonder if you're leaving one out. The possibility that occurred in 1917 would reoccur now, where the soldiers who are being butchered turn their weapons on their officers, kill them, and go back home, which led to the 1917 revolution.
Yeah.
It was the soldiers that did it.
Yep. That was not a question, that's a comment.
Well, do you think it could happen again?
Oh, the parallel, yeah. But you know, the parallel, unfortunately, is not as nice as it was in 1917. I got a report this morning, which I read before I came here. It talked about the Wagner Group. You know about the Wagner Group? Give me some nods. Yeah, you know what you're talking about? Yeah, okay. He's been in a battle now with the Kremlin. He used to be a buddy of Putin. First of all, Wagner himself was a criminal. He was in prison for about 10 years. And Putin popped him out. Then he gave him the opportunity to start a restaurant in St. Petersburg, and Putin used to go there to eat, so they called him Putin's chef. Then Putin made him into a billionaire by stealing all kinds of contracts. So he'd had a long relationship, but now he's a threat against Putin because his army, his mercenaries, have become very powerful now. And he's been claiming all these victories and trying to humiliate the Ministry of Defense because they can't fight like my guys can fight. Then he made the mistake a couple months ago of saying, I might consider the possibility of running for president in 2024. You don't do that in Putin's world. You're in serious trouble if you declare yourself a candidate for the presidency. So he made that mistake. So with all this stuff going on, Department of Defense started cutting off munitions to his troops. Stopped giving them ammunition, taking away his systems. And now his troops basically have no ammunition to fight anymore. And many of them are on a 6-month contract, which he said, if you come and work for me for 6 months, you will be freed from prison and you'll have no penalty against you. Many of these peoples are rapists, murderers, absolute vicious crooks fighting for him. Now, what do you think about this? You're living in a village someplace, and this former criminal comes in. He's now been retired from the Wagner Group, but he's coming home with his munitions, his ammunition, his rifles, his machine guns, and he's going to live in your village. I mean, this is the kind of chaos you're beginning to see in Russia right now. It's just absolutely out of control in terms of weapon systems and who's a threat and who's not a threat. I would say there's no way the military forces, unlike 1917, would turn against Putin because he's got them under his thumb. And these security agencies, I mentioned there are 5 of them, they compete with each other to watch out on the other ones. So there's no way you could get away with stuff in that country without somebody else knowing about it. I mean, these people are all tracking over each other and they're competing with beating up protesters. I mean, we have these videos of some of these elderly people standing in demonstrations, and these Russian security troops come in and start beating up these old women and old men with sticks and battalions. I mean, they're all trying to see, look at Mr. President, how faithful we are, how loyal we are to you. I mean, so the possibility of a military move is not likely. Let's keep going.
John, that first map that you put up, you said that the countries that surrounded Ukraine and that were contiguous to many of them were NATO members.
Yes,
Can you tell us which countries are
Yeah.
NATO members that are
Yeah,
right?
sure.
next- Yeah.
Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. Those 4 countries. Pardon? Not Belarus. Belarus is what we used to call in the old days White Russia. He's under the thumb of Putin. He's an autocrat dictator in Belarus. His time is very short. He's not going to be around very long. Putin is trying to get Belarus to get involved in the war because they're right on the border with Russia, and to use send some of their troops into Russia as a part of the war. And Lukashenko knows Belarusians do not want to fight their friends in Ukraine. They've made it very clear. So they blow up railroad stations, they blow up railroad tracks, they blow up military bases. They're not going to do it. So Putin pressures this guy, and his people say, if you do it, you're done. So he's caught in a very difficult situation. That could change. He could do something stupid, and it might be much more serious than this. But basically, these other 4 are doing unbelievable benefit in terms of what they're supplying. And this was not a part of your question, but I'll just lay it on. This comes free, by the way, with your fee. Yeah. The NATO countries are actually talking now about the possibility of putting 300,000 NATO soldiers on their eastern borders. 300,000 NATO forces on their eastern border. To say to Russia, you trip over this wire, you got a problem. And many of those countries, including up to Scandinavia and the Baltic republics, are putting in a tripwire, barbed wire fences now that's going to separate these countries from Russia. So all along the western border of Russia, every one of the countries is putting in miles of fences, barbed wire, ditches. So Europe is going to be divided like this all the way along the border from Russia. I mean, that's unbelievable. Who would have imagined that 2 years ago? That Europe would be divided like this? How we doing question-wise? Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know specifics, but I understand that Zelensky's background is not exactly lily white. And I wonder if that's part of the reason that they might have trouble gaining entrance to NATO.
What about Zelensky's background?
I've heard just comments that he doesn't have a great background himself in terms of being a Democratic president. Can you comment on?
Yeah. I don't know what news source you're listening to, but I'll say a couple of things about Zelensky. He is a remarkable man. There's nothing in his background that would be a problem. He has a law degree, but then he went into theater and he became an actor. And then you may know he started a program called Servant of the People, where he played the role of a high school teacher, which is what I wanted to be, played the role of a high school teacher who then becomes president of the country. And the program became incredibly popular in Ukraine. He was one of the most popular people in the country. And so when the next election, presidential election came along, he said decided he wanted to throw his hat in the ring, and his wife said, "Don't do it. You got 2 little kids, you got me, you can't be doing this." But he decided, they talked again, and he decided to do it. Now, the interesting thing about him is that when he was in theater, he had improv theater, like they have at Hope and like they have at Calvin. He would do presentations with many government officials in the audience, criticizing them for corruption. They're stealing from the government. These people in this ministry are stealing from the government. People in this ministry. So he became famous in the country because he was identifying these things that were real. And he's not apologizing. And many of them are sitting right in the audience. But he was fearless. He would not stop because he said, we got to clean this country up. And this is the only way it's going to happen. So that's the positive thing about his background. There's not much else negative that I know about him. Now, I'm aware of some debates he's had with certain political figures. There were a couple oligarchs that supported him early on in his career, and he's been accused of some links to those people, but he's broken all those links. He's been identified by a British journalist as Winston Churchill with an iPhone. Just like Winston Churchill in World War II. But the difference is he's got an iPhone. And he talks to the people, I think 3 or 4 times a day about things that are going on in the country. So he is in direct communication with his citizens. I mean, it's absolutely unparalleled. Putin sees nobody. He hides in the Kremlin. He's got about 4 or 5 people he talks to. That's it. But here's Zelensky out there with the people. He goes on to the front lines, meets with the soldiers. He goes to hospitals where soldiers are wounded and being helped. And you notice the outfit that he wears? That's not accidental. He is wearing an outfit, a green outfit with the zipped up fleet coat that volunteer Ukrainian workers wear. He's saying, I'm not a czar. I'm one of you. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's what I think is going on there. Now, I do want to say 3 elections are coming up in 24. United States, Russia, Ukraine. It just so happens that all 3 countries are going to have elections again. It's not clear to me, well, in our country either, and it's not clear to me in Russia because we don't know where Putin's going to be at that point. But in Ukraine, I wonder if Zelensky will survive. I don't know. He's a very popular man. But you know what happened to Churchill at the end of World War II. Thank you, Mr. Churchill. But the war's over. You're done. That could happen to Zelensky. He's a loved and respected man. But I could imagine some people would say once the war's over, okay, now we need to start all over again with a new democratic government. You didn't ask that, but that came free. You got to go ahead.
Did more people die in the eastern Ukraine than the western Ukraine under Stalin in 1933-ish? Oh, okay. Do you think, did more people die in the eastern Ukraine than the rest of the Ukraine when Stalin starved them to death in 1933? Is that why there would be more Russians in the eastern Ukraine?
I'm not exactly sure of the thrust of your question. I mean, if you're making a reference to the Red Famine, which was when the Soviet Union basically clamped down on agriculture in Ukraine and starved that country, that cost the Ukrainian people 4 million lives. They'll never forget what happened to them. So that's unparalleled, of course. And they lost massive numbers of troops in World War I. They lost massive numbers of troops in World War II. Then comes this famine in addition. Now, is that any parallel to the number of people who've been killed? No, I mean. No, I think there's more people who are Russian oriented in the eastern part of the country, because as I mentioned earlier, the Russians brought them in to work in those factories, to run those industries, to be involved in those businesses. Khrushchev came in, Khrushchev came to power, for example, he went into Ukraine and just eliminated the whole leadership cadre in Ukraine, across the country. Had them shipped off, murdered, deported. So the whole leadership was removed. They didn't do that, of course, in the areas that were controlled by the Russians during that period of time. So there was that tilt, of course, in favor of that part of the country, in favor of Russia. But I'm trying to make the point to you that at this point, that part of the country is as much in support of Zelensky as any other part of the country. They want unity. They've had enough of Russia. I mean, how much massacre can you take? Even in those areas in eastern Ukraine, Russians are bombing those cities where their most popular people live and destroying those villages. And their occupying forces are coming in and taking the people who live there and throwing them out of the building and taking over those homes for their occupation army. These are people who would be in favor of Russia because they've had a history of relationships. And the Russian army just destroys them. So that's the kind of dynamic. I mean, you watch that for a while and you understand why would they ever want Russian back again. And Zelensky has made that very clear. Yes. You've been waving your hand for quite a while. Hi, I'm John Bernbaum. It's nice to have you here.
I'd like you to share your thoughts on Russia's invasion of Crimea and the fact that they got away with it and the West did not intervene. And whether that, to me, maybe to you, I don't know, and kind of empowered Putin to think, well, we got away with it once, we'll try it again.
You're very smart. I'm going to get you a degree in political science if we can. Did you get the question?
Sure.
The question was, when the Russians moved into Crimea, took over Crimea, also the other provinces, other areas, what was the response on the part of the West? Why didn't the West respond? And what did the Russians learn from that? That's a very, very important question. That is one of the reasons I think Putin made the decision that he made about the war right now. I mean, the miscalculations that Putin has made by attacking Ukraine in 2022 were unbelievable miscalculations in my judgment. But part of it was based on the fact that he thought, look what we did in 2014. They didn't do anything. Now, there's a lot of political dynamics going on in the West about that, and I'm not going to get into all the domestic politics, but the reality is the West went, gee, that's too bad. And they didn't do anything. Well, he came to the conclusions that that's, in fact, what they'll do now. The American government is weak. NATO is weak. They don't have any backbone. I own a significant part of Germany and UK because I got so much of my money invested in those countries. They're not going to fight. There's going to be no resistance. I mean, his people were telling him, we're going to take over Ukraine in 3 to 5 days. I mean, they had no idea what he was getting into, but part of it was because of his perception of corruption and weakness on the part of the West. He can't believe what happened when NATO came together like this and 30 nations cooperated together to build a defensive system to protect Ukraine. That's beyond his imagination. He never expected, but part of it was because we contributed to it. How we doing?
We have several questions from online, and one of them you just really pretty much dealt with, but Don was asking also, why was this allowed without more resistance or external support?
Why was what?
The Crimea invasion, why did we let them get away with it? It might be an adder to your previous answer.
Why did we not? It's the same question?
Pretty much, yeah, but I wasn't sure if you answered this part of it was, why was this allowed without more resistance?
It was, I don't want to get, I'll say it again, I don't want to get involved in all domestic politics there that was going on during that period of time, but because it's very complex. But part of it was a struggle on the part of the American leadership about what's our role in the world? And what are we doing fighting all these wars overseas, and why are we getting involved in places we shouldn't get involved in? So Ukraine's not part of our, I mean, the Obama administration basically said it's not part of our business, not our business. And so that's what happened. And that's part of the things we're talking about here in terms of consequences. But I'm telling you right now, and this is just kind of add on to this question, Ukrainians are not going to walk away from Crimea. Some people say go to the peace table, and if the Russians want to hold on to Crimea, that's okay, but they'll give the rest of the country back to us. Ukrainians are saying that's not going to happen. We got to get them out of there. And the reality of that is that if Russians are forced out of Crimea, it's going to change the whole Mediterranean world, because they won't be able to use their navy to be a Mediterranean power. So we could have some very positive peacekeeping realities if we get the Russians out of Crimea. And Zelensky's going to try real hard to do that. Okay. United States, some of our people in our government are saying, "Oh, you can't push him too hard," and but I think it's a very important issue. There's another question.
Yeah, then we had two people ask very similar questions. Do you think there is much of a chance that Putin will use tactical nuclear weapons if he feels backed into a corner, or if the stalemate continues? And if this happens, how does it affect possible future scenarios for Ukraine?
I'm surprised it took this long to get to that question. The first two questions I always get is, when's Putin going to be done? When's he going to be gone? And secondly, when's he going to use the nuclear weapons? What does the sign say? It's complicated, right? I put that sign up there. Couple thoughts. Putin would love to have the West argue about and talk about the possible use of nuclear weapons, and have these big debates and argue back and forth, and how far can you push them, and how, he'd love that to happen. Putin is the master of distraction. I don't want them talking about what I'm doing in Ukraine. So let's get him talking about the nuclear thing. So every once in a while, he rattles the nuclear weapons, and it gets the West, gets all bent out of shape, and they start talking about this, and it takes their attention away from what's going on the battlefield. He is murdering people every day. He doesn't want attention on that. So he rattles that nuclear weapon periodically. Now, would he use a nuclear weapon? It's a massive debate going on in this country and all over Western Europe. And I track this stuff and all these conversations, and there's a lot of argument back and forth about this. But I would say most people think there is a very low probability that he will ever use a nuclear weapon for the following reasons. Number one, Nuclear weapons are not tactical battlefield weapons. It would do very little, it wouldn't help him very much in terms of his war effort if he drops a nuclear weapon on part of Ukraine. And in fact, if he dropped a weapon on even the central part of Ukraine, the winds would come along and take that nuclear reactor material, not only over Ukraine, but also over Russia. So he would suffer from the consequences because of some of the nuclear reactivity. So that's the second factor. Another factor is NATO and the United States government has made it very clear to the Kremlin. We don't know for sure the precise language that was used, but we've got a pretty good understanding of it. And by the way, so much of the things that we're talking about right now, in the old days, you would never have this kind of information available, but it's all over right now. I mean, there's all kinds of leaks from Kremlin, from dissidents who are unhappy in Russia and who work for Putin, but spill this information out. So we've learned a lot more than we've ever knew was possible. But the other thing is that we're basically saying to Putin, you use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, our response from NATO will be non-nuclear, but we will absolutely destroy your conventional army. It'll be just totally destroyed. And some NATO officers said we could do that in about a week. Not with foot soldiers, but with missile systems that we can control. And so Putin has to think about that consequence. I do this, I could lose everything. And so there's some question about whether even his military officers, if they were told to push the button, whether they would do it or not. And if they know it's going to lead to a total collapse of their country, it probably wouldn't happen. So those are some of the insights that I think that are going on right now, the debate going on. But I would say that I'd say people that I trust the most on this stuff are saying it's a 5 to 10% factor that you would ever use a weapon, but you never know with a person like this. The former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who's known Putin for years, he was former National Security Council, then he was the former ambassador. He's written an article recently. He says, I know this guy very well, but I'm telling you, I don't know what he's going to do. You can't predict a person like this because he's so isolated. He has no accountability. So who's going to stop him? Whatever he decides. And that's some of the mystery involved here. You had a question? Another question? Go ahead.
He says he's okay, but we did have one more online that Fred wants to know what was the trigger for Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. So I suppose the immediate reason why he did it when he did it.
Yeah. Well, that's the point I tried to start off with. And so I'll say it again in shorthand. Putin needs a war to stay in power. He can't survive if he's not at war. And if it's not Ukraine, it's going to be somebody else because he's in trouble. His economy is in trouble. The country has weakened. And so the only way he can justify internal repression in that country is to say there's a war going on and I got to stop all this opposition from undermining. They're a bunch of traitors. They're fifth columnists. So I got to oppress them. But we know with autocracies, it's not the use of violence against your own system, your own citizens, is not an easy thing to decide because you push that autocracy and the violence against your people too hard, it'll force a revolution, force a break. So these autocracies can use violence against their people, but they do it in measured ways. And so it seems out of hand right now. I would say this quickly. The repression and the violence in Russia against its own citizens is as bad now as it was under Joseph Stalin in the 1930s, when we called it the Great Terror. It's as bad now as it was in the 30s. So that's the environment we're talking about. It's a really difficult environment, tough environment. Yes, go ahead. Good
Yeah,
questions.
I appreciated your response about Zelensky because I think he's just absolutely amazing and strong. I worry about him. How about, is he under assassination attempts or whatever? I mean, could they, could Russia go to that point and try to, kill the leader and discourage the country?
Oh, yeah, there has been, I don't know the exact number, but I think there's been at least 10 to 12 assassination attempts against him already that his own security people have taken care of. So he walks a difficult line because he's not going to hide in the basement someplace. I mean, he is going to go out and be there with people. And if he loses his life, I mean, he's already talked about this, then that's part of the price he has to pay for. And his wife knows that well. His wife is an amazing woman too, Elena. So they know there's some cost, but he is carefully protected, just like the Putin is. But, there's a story going around now is that Putin no longer likes to fly. He has his own train now. And it's a train just like the train that Joseph Stalin created during World War II to protect him when he moved around to different battlefields. So he's already thinking Stalinist mode. I got to do what Uncle Joe did. He got his own train. But now he's had some second considerations about that, because if we wanted to, we could pick that train up and destroy it very quickly. So now he's having doubts about that. So it's a tough situation. I mean, they could go after him. Zelensky, Russians could go after Ukrainians could go after Putin. It would have a dramatic effect on the war, of course, if that happened. But the Ukrainians are starting to take shots into Russia now. And they have an underground partisan network of guerrilla warfare people, many of whom were trained in the United States and Canada, by the way, who are doing causing all kinds of chaos in Russia. And oil facilities are blowing up. Airplanes are being destroyed at airports. And everybody's going, oh, who caused that? And the Ukrainians are saying, the problem with the Russians is that they smoke when they're around gas tanks. And they got to stop doing that. So Ukrainians are denying any involvement, but we know what they're doing. I mean, they're just unbelievable what's going on right now. And some Russians themselves are blowing up recruitment centers, military depots. So there's a lot of frustration going on. The level of hatred and animosity is so high in that country right now. Yes.
Hopefully one last question because we're running out of time, but given the Russian resistance to the idea, is it realistic to think that Ukraine will ever become a member of NATO?
Will become a what?
Ever become a member of NATO?
Oh, Lordy. You never say never. I study international relations too long. You never say never. There's a very strong desire on the part of people in Eastern Europe to pull Ukraine in. Because Ukraine has given them protection. They're paying the price for what they would have to pay in Poland or Romania if they went after them. So those countries are going to continue to lobby very strongly. It's unclear to me, this is my language, that the French have a backbone. Not clear. The British have been doing a pretty impressive job, but there was a lot of questions about them originally having the strength to stand up. And of course, the Germans. I mean, the Germans are very closely tied to Russia because of all of the resource exports they send into Germany. And so Putin has assumed that the Germans are mine. I mean, when the former president of Germany retires and is put on the board of trustees of Gazprom and makes $200,000 a year as a trustee for 2 meetings a year, that's not a bad deal. So there was a close alliance between those groups. But when this war broke out, Germany did a U-turn. And now they've become tremendous supporters of Ukraine. So it's a different dynamic. So the answer to your question is, I really don't know. I think it's a possibility that down the road a ways, it'll happen. Because they need that strength. And the power of NATO is going from England and France, and it's moving east to Poland, Romania, and these countries that are along the edge of Russia. So there's that dynamic going on there. And in that dynamic, Ukraine would play a very important role. Okay, friends.
Let's show our appreciation to
I'll
Dr.
be with you.
Bernbaum. And also remember to come back next week.